The squeak of the rubber wheels was the only sound that broke the heavy silence of the 40th floor. It was a rhythmic, almost lonely sound,
echoing off the polished concrete floors and glass walls of the vast open-plan office.
For Maya, the sound was a lullaby, a familiar tune that marked the hours of her shift. At 24, she was a ghost in this world of high finance and cutting-edge technology, a phantom moving through the empty spaces with her cart of cleaning supplies. Her uniform, a simple gray tunic and trousers, was designed to be forgotten, and she had perfected the art of being invisible to the daytime occupants of this gleaming tower. She was just the janitor. They would see her pushing her cart, maybe offer a tight, distracted smile if their paths crossed near the elevators, but their eyes would never truly focus on her. She was part of the building's infrastructure, like the air conditioning or the lighting, necessary but unnoticed. Maya didn't mind. Invisibility gave her freedom. It allowed her to observe without being observed, to listen without being part of the conversation as she worked. Her hands moved with an automatic efficiency, spraying and wiping surfaces until they gleamed under the dim emergency lighting. But her mind was far from the mundane task of cleaning. Tucked snugly in her ear, a single wireless earbud played a lecture on quantum computing, the complex concepts washing over her. She wasn't just hearing the words. She was processing them, turning them over in her head, visualizing the abstract theories as intricate dancing patterns of light. This was her real world, not the sterile office she was scrubbing. It was a world she had been forced to leave behind. 3 years ago, Maya had been on a different path. She had been a student at one of the most prestigious computer science programs in the country. Her mind a natural fit for the elegant logic of code and the vast, interconnected architecture of digital systems. She saw patterns where others saw chaos, solutions where others saw dead ends. But life, as it often does, had thrown a wrench in her carefully constructed plans. A sudden illness in her family had meant the end of her scholarship and the need for an immediate steady income. The night shift at a major tech firm, while a world away from the lecture halls, paid the bills. It was a sacrifice she made without hesitation. But the ache of that unfinished dream never truly left her, so she learned on her own. She devoured discarded technical manuals left in the break room, spent her meager breaks watching advanced coding tutorials on her phone, and listened to podcasts like the one currently playing in her ear. The office became her unofficial library. She knew which teams were working on which projects by the diagrams left on whiteboards. She could tell when a department was under stress by the sheer volume of empty coffee cups and crumpled printouts in their recycling bins. She was a silent student of the entire corporation, piecing together its inner workings from the fragments it left behind. Tonight, a different kind of energy hung in the air, a lingering tension that clung to the furniture like a bad smell. The silence felt heavier, more deliberate. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty building. It was the held-breath silence of a room after a terrible argument. As she moved her cart towards the executive wing, she saw why. The usually pristine conference room was a disaster. Whiteboards were covered in frantic red scrawls, complex flowcharts that ended in jagged, dead-end arrows. The floor was littered with discarded paper cups and the wrappers of late-night energy bars. It looked like the aftermath of a battle. Maya began her work, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't just cleaning. She was gathering information. Her eyes scanned the discarded notes on the table. She didn't understand all of it, but certain words jumped out at her, repeated over and over in angry. Underlined script, untraceable, data bleed, systemic failure. And one number, circled so aggressively the pen had torn through the paper, $50 million. The number was so large it was almost abstract, a fantasy figure from a movie. But the fear on those whiteboards was very real. She could almost feel the panic that had saturated this room just hours ago. These people, the architects of the digital world she so admired, were scared, and they had no idea what to do. Earlier that day, the world of Innovatech Dynamics had been rocked to its core. The company's CEO, Robert Sterling, a man whose sharp suits and sharper intellect had become a symbol of the company's success, had called an emergency all-hands meeting. The atmosphere in the main auditorium had been electric with a mixture of fear and confusion. Robert, a man who rarely showed a crack in his composure, had stood before them looking 10 years older. "We are facing a critical situation," he had said, his voice strained. "A significant anomaly has appeared in our primary financial software. We are projecting a data-related loss of approximately $50 million. A collective gasp had rippled through the crowd. $50 million wasn't just a number. It was jobs, futures, the very stability of the company they had all helped build. Our internal teams, along with the best external consultants we could find, have been working around the clock," Robert continued, his gaze sweeping over the worried faces of his employees. "But the source of this anomaly remains elusive. It is not a hack. It is not a virus. It is something else. It is a ghost in the machine." He explained that the system was creating phantom transactions and corrupting data in a way that was both sophisticated and seemingly random. Money was vanishing from digital ledgers, leaving behind no trail, no digital footprint. The company's most brilliant minds were stumped. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't define, and couldn't stop. The board was breathing down his neck. The company's stock was beginning to wobble. And the threat of mass layoffs hung over everyone's head like a storm cloud. It was, as he admitted with a heavy heart, the greatest crisis the company had ever faced. Now, hours later, Maya stood in the quiet aftermath of that panic. She carefully erased the frantic scrawls from the whiteboard, the red ink smearing under her cloth. As she wiped away a complex diagram labeled Data Flow Architecture, her eyes caught a detail in the corner. It was a small string of code, circled in a different color, blue. It looked like a simple error log, a timestamp, and a user ID. But something about it nagged at her. The user ID wasn't in the standard format the company used. It was an old alphanumeric string, a relic from a system that should have been decommissioned years ago. It was a tiny, insignificant detail in a sea of desperate notes, something the high-paid analysts had likely glanced at and dismissed. But Maya's mind, trained to see the patterns others missed, locked onto it. She finished cleaning the room, her usual methodical rhythm now replaced by a quiet, buzzing curiosity. She pushed her cart out of the conference room and down the hall. Her mind no longer on the lecture in her ear, the earbud was silent now. Her entire focus was on that small blue circle, that ghost from the past. She didn't know what it meant, not yet. But as she looked down the long, empty corridor, a new feeling began to stir within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was the thrill of the puzzle, the first glimmer of an impossible solution. The ghost in the machine had left a clue, and for the first time, someone had seen it. The invisible janitor had just seen the invisible hand. Asterisk, the squeak of the cartwheels faded as Maya pushed her cleaning supplies back into the small utility closet. The automatic click of the lock seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the 40th floor. Her shift was over, but her work had just begun. The image of that small blue circle was burned into the back of her eyelids, a tiny beacon in the overwhelming darkness of the company's crisis. Her heart was still beating a little too fast, a frantic drum solo against the quiet rhythm of her breathing. She felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in years, the sharp, intoxicating pull of a truly complex problem. She rode the elevator down alone, watching the floor numbers descend, feeling like she was moving between two different worlds. Up there, she was a ghost, a shadow. Down here on the streets of the city, as the first hint of dawn painted the sky, she was just Maya, a young woman heading home after a long night. But tonight, she carried a secret with her, a piece of a puzzle that didn't belong to her, but one she felt an irresistible urge to solve. The subway car was mostly empty, filled with the quiet, tired faces of other early morning workers. Maya found a seat in the corner and pulled out her old phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she navigated to her photos. There it was. The picture was terrible, just as she'd expected. The flash had reflected off the glossy whiteboard, turning half the image into a white blur. But in the corner, the blue circle was visible, and inside it, the string of code was just legible. She zoomed in, the pixels distorting into a messy mosaic, but the characters were clear enough. Us are _OM7749. It was an odd format, It's nothing like the standard 8-digit employee IDs used by the company. The OM part was what intrigued her the most. It felt like a signature, a remnant of something else. By the time she reached her small apartment, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the dusty window. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint scent of the lavender sachet her mother kept by her bed. Her mother was asleep in the next room, her breathing soft and even. Maya stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. The reason for all of this, the sacrifices, the late nights, the dream put on hold, was lying right there. A fierce protectiveness washed over her. This wasn't just about a puzzle anymore. This company, Innovatic Dynamics, paid her salary. A salary that paid for her mother's medicine, for the roof over their heads. If the company failed, they would fail with it. The problem on the 40th floor was now her problem. 2. She quietly closed the door and sat down at the small, wobbly kitchen table which served as her desk, her dining table, and her workspace. She opened her laptop, a second-hand machine with a cracked screen and a fan that whined like a distressed animal. It was her portal to another world. She typed the user ID into a search engine, but the results were meaningless. It was too specific, too buried. She needed a different approach. She started with what she knew. The company had grown rapidly, not just by building new things, but by buying smaller ones. She began to search for the company's acquisition history, digging through old press releases and tech news articles from a decade ago. It was tedious work, like panning for gold in a river of corporate jargon. She spent hours sifting through information, her eyes burning with fatigue. She made a pot of strong, bitter coffee, the smell filling the small apartment as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Then she found it. An article from 10 years ago about the acquisition of a smaller logistics software firm. The name of that firm had been Omni Logistics. OM. The connection sent a jolt through her, a spark of excitement that cut through her exhaustion. She read everything she could find about this old company, about their proprietary software, about the way they managed data. It was like being an archaeologist, dusting off the fossils of a dead digital beast. Her hypothesis began to form. A delicate structure built from fragments of information. When Innovatech Dynamics had bought Omni Logistics, they hadn't rebuilt their systems from the ground up. That would have been too expensive and time-consuming. Instead, they had done what most big companies do. They had created a bridge, patch, a clumsy piece of code to allow the old Omni system to talk to the new Innovatic one. They had grafted a limb onto a body without properly checking for blood type compatibility. The user ID USR_OM7749 was a ghost from that old system, a digital relic that should have been retired but was still floating around in the codebase, dormant and forgotten. The experts, the highly paid consultants, were looking for a sophisticated attack. They were searching for a hacker, a virus, a complex piece of malware. But Maya was starting to believe the truth was much simpler and much more dangerous. The problem wasn't an enemy from the outside. It was a flaw within. A tiny, forgotten piece of old code was being accidentally triggered by a modern process, creating a conflict that rippled through the entire financial system. It was like a single, misplaced cog in a giant watch, causing the whole mechanism to grind to a halt and break. It was a theory, a good one, but it was just a theory. She needed proof. She needed to show them, not just tell them. But how could she possibly prove it? She didn't have access to the company's live systems. She couldn't just waltz into the server room and start running diagnostics. Then, an idea struck her. She couldn't test the real thing, but she could build a model. A miniature, simplified version of the system. A digital diorama where she could recreate the conditions and see if her theory held water. This was the hard part. It would require coding, a lot of it. And she would need a place to do it where she wouldn't be tracked. Her home internet connection was basic, but it was tied to her name. She needed to be anonymous. She thought of the public library, a place of quiet anonymity and free computer access. It was perfect. The next day, after a few hours of sleep, she headed to the library. It was a vast, hushed space filled with the smell of old paper and the gentle hum of knowledge. She found a secluded carrel in the back, fired up one of the clunky public desktops, and got to work. She had a 2-hour time limit on the computer. A clock ticking in the corner of the screen, adding a sense of urgency to her task. She began to build her simulation. It was a painstaking process. She had to recreate the data flow, the interaction between the old Omni system and the new Innovetic ledger. She used her knowledge of software architecture, the things she had learned in college and the things she had taught herself since. She scribbled notes in a worn notebook, her pen flying across the page, mapping out the logic, the connections, the potential points of failure. The library world around her faded away. The rustle of turning pages, the soft cough of a patron a few aisles over, the distant chime of the return desk, it all melted into a background hum. Her entire universe was contained within the glowing screen, and the pages of her notebook, day after day, returned to the library. She would finish her cleaning shift, catch a few hours of sleep, and then head to her new post. She became a fixture in the back corner, the young woman with the intense focus and the mountain of scribbled notes. She hit dead ends constantly. Her simulation would crash, but not in the right way. The data corruption wasn't replicating. Frustration gnawed at her. There was a piece she was missing, a variable she hadn't accounted for. One evening, while eating a sandwich in the small park across from the library, she was scrolling through a tech forum on her phone, a habit she couldn't break. She came across a thread discussing old data handling protocols. Someone mentioned a specific type of error that occurred when two different systems tried to process a high-volume transaction at the exact same millisecond. It was a race condition, a term she remembered from her studies. It was a rare, almost impossible to replicate bug, the kind that drove programmers crazy. And suddenly, it all clicked. The phantom transactions weren't just caused by the old code being triggered. They were caused by a timing issue. The new system and the old ghost system were trying to write to the same piece of data at the same time. And the old system, with its outdated logic, was winning. Corrupting the data and creating the financial black hole, she rushed back into the library, her heart pounding. She only had 45 minutes left on her computer session. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, frantically rewriting a crucial part of her simulation's code. She built in a function to simulate a high-volume data stream hitting both systems simultaneously. She set the parameters, her hand hovering over the Enter key. This was it, the moment of truth. She took a deep breath and pressed the key. The screen froze. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a window popped up, displaying a string of garbled data. It was the exact same type of data corruption described in the frantic notes from the conference room. She had done it. In her small, simulated world, she had recreated the $50 million crisis. A quiet, triumphant smile spread across her face. She leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, a wave of relief and exhilaration washing over her. She had found the ghost in the machine. She had given it a name and a face, but as the library's closing announcement echoed through the quiet halls, the reality of her situation came crashing down. She had the answer. She had the proof. But she was still just Maya, the janitor. And she was sitting in a public library, looking at a simulation on a timed computer, while a team of the country's top IT experts were failing to solve the same problem in a gleaming tower downtown. The problem was no longer finding the solution. The problem was figuring out how to make anyone listen to the person who found it. The walk home from the library that night felt different. The city lights, usually a blurry, indifferent backdrop to her exhaustion, seemed sharper, more vibrant. It was as if a filter had been lifted from the world, and she was seeing it in a higher definition. The knowledge she carried was a heavy, warm secret pressed against her ribs. She had solved it. The ghost in the machine had a name, and she was the only one who knew it. But the triumph was quickly shadowed by a daunting practical question that echoed with every step she took on the cold pavement. Now what? She couldn't just call the company switchboard and ask to be put through to the CEO. Hello, this is the janitor. I've figured out your $50 million problem. The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. They would hang up, thinking it was a prank. An email was out of the question. She didn't have an official company address, and any message from a personal account would be flagged as spam and deleted without a second thought. She needed to be careful, strategic. She had the solution, but she was still invisible. And invisible people aren't taken seriously. Back in the quiet of her apartment, with the soft, steady breath of her mother, a comforting sound from the next room, Maya sat at her wobbly table and opened her laptop. The simulation file glowed on the screen, a testament to her success. Now, she had to translate this complex digital event into a language that busy, panicked executives could understand and, more importantly, believe. She couldn't just hand them a mess of code. She needed a plan. She spent the next few hours meticulously writing a report. It wasn't long, but it was precise. She started with a simple, bold statement. The root cause of the financial anomaly is not a virus or external attack, but a legacy code conflict from the 2014 OmniLogistics acquisition. She explained the concept of the ghost user ID, the old data handling protocol, and the race condition in the simplest terms she could. Using analogies like two people trying to write on the same spot on a piece of paper at the exact same time, she then laid out the solution, a targeted patch to isolate the legacy module and a change in the data type conversion to prevent the conflict. She attached screenshots from her simulation, clearly showing the before and after, the system crash, and the stable result. It was perfect. It was clear, concise, and it had the proof to back it up. All it needed was a pair of eyes that would actually read it. Her first plan was one of stealth. She decided to print the report and deliver it anonymously. It was the safest option. If they listened, great. If they didn't, no one would ever know it was her, and she wouldn't lose her job. The next afternoon, a few hours before her shift was due to start, she went to a print shop far from her neighborhood, using cash to pay for the copies. The crisp white papers in her hand felt both powerful and dangerous. She entered the Innovatech tower during the late afternoon shift change, a time of bustling chaos when people were coming and going, making it easier for a cleaning uniform to blend in. Her heart hammered against her ribs with every step. The elevator ride to the 40th floor felt like an ascent to the gallows. She got off her cart waiting for her in the utility closet where she had left it that morning. The floor was still alive with activity, a stark contrast to the silent tomb she was used to. She had to wait. She spent an hour cleaning the less populated areas, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced, her eyes constantly scanning the hallway leading to the IT department. Finally, she saw her chance. The head of IT, a man she recognized from company newsletters as a stern, serious-looking individual, walked out of his office and headed towards the elevators, barking orders into his phone. The corridor was empty. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Maya walked quickly to his office door. It was slightly ajar. She didn't hesitate. She slid the 10-page report, neatly stapled under the gap. For a second, she considered knocking, drawing his attention. But the fear was too strong. She pushed the paper the rest of the way and retreated. Melting back into the shadows of the corridor, before anyone could see her, she felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of terror and elation. She had done it. The ball was in their court. She went about her shift that night with a nervous energy, cleaning with a renewed purpose, her ears straining for any hint of a breakthrough. But she heard nothing. The next morning, she left work with a flicker of hope, imagining a team of experts huddled around her report, their faces lighting up with understanding. The hope died the following night. She was emptying the recycling bins in the executive wing, a task she usually did with mechanical detachment. When she reached the head of IT's office, she saw it. Tucked neatly inside the blue recycling bin, under a pile of discarded coffee cups and junk mail, was her report. It was exactly as she had left it, the staple still in the corner. But on the top page, in thick, red angry marker, were two words: crank, nuisance. A cold, heavy feeling settled in her stomach. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a wave of humiliation so intense it made her dizzy. She had poured her mind, her time, her hope into those pages, and it had been dismissed without a second thought. He hadn't even read it. He had seen the anonymous source, the lack of an official letterhead, and had thrown it away. To him, it was just the rambling of a lunatic. She carefully pulled the report out of the bin, the crinkled paper feeling like a personal insult, and shoved it deep into the pocket of her tunic. She felt small and stupid. Over the next few days, the situation at the company grew even more desperate. The crisis was no longer an internal secret. It was on the news. Maya saw it on a TV in a diner while grabbing a bite to eat. The financial anchor was talking about innovative dynamics, using words like plummeting stock price, investor panic, and potential bankruptcy. The company was now bleeding money from every direction. Not just from the glitch, but from the loss of confidence in the market. The board of directors was, according to the news report, considering drastic measures, including massive layoffs that would affect thousands of employees. The weight of it all pressed down on Maya. This wasn't just about a puzzle anymore. It was about people. People like her, whose livelihoods depended on this company. People who had no idea that their jobs were hanging by a thread because of a 10-page report sitting in a recycling bin. Her quiet, anonymous gamble had failed, and the consequences were catastrophic. Staying silent was no longer an option. It was a betrayal. She spent her next night shift in a fog of anger and resolve. The invisibility that had once been her shield now felt like a cage. She was trapped, watching a disaster unfold, holding the key to stop it, but unable to get out. She looked at the faces in the framed photos on the walls, the smiling employees of the month, the team-building pictures. They were all at risk. As she pushed her cart down the silent, polished hallways, a new plan began to form in her mind. It was a crazy, reckless, terrifying plan. There would be no more anonymity, no more hiding. She would have to step out of the shadows, leave her cart behind, and walk into the light. She would have to face them, not as a janitor with a note, but as the person who had the answer. She didn't know how or when, but she knew she had to do it. The ghost in the machine had been found, and now it was time for its finder to reveal herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut. But it was now joined by something stronger, a fierce, unwavering determination. The next few nights felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare, playing out in slow motion. Maya moved through her routines with a body on autopilot, while her mind was a whirlwind of strategy and fear. The discarded report, still crumpled in the pocket of her uniform, felt like a constant, heavy reminder of her failure and the stakes of what she was about to do. The atmosphere in the tower had grown even more toxic. The daytime staff no longer just looked stressed. They looked haunted. Conversations stopped abruptly when she walked by, and the whispers that followed her were filled with words like layoffs, restructuring, and last chance. The company was a patient bleeding out on the operating table, and the surgeons were arguing about the type of scalpel to use. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. Each night, she would finish her cleaning on the executive floor and then linger. Her cart parked in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the corner office at the end of the hall, the CEO's office. She had seen him on the company website and in the newsletters, a man with a sharp jawline and a confident smile. But the man she saw in the building was a different person. He was always the last to leave, his silhouette a solitary figure against the vast cityscape. His shoulders slumped with the weight of the world. He looked as tired as she felt. On a Thursday night, the opportunity she had been waiting for finally arrived. It was well past midnight, and the 40th floor was a tomb of silent, dark workstations, all except one. The light in the corner office was still on, a single beacon in the darkness. Maya took a deep breath, her heart thudding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. This was it. There would be no more planning, no more rehearsing what to say in her head. It was now or never. She left her cart by the elevators, a strange and terrifying act of abandonment. It felt like leaving a piece of her identity behind. She was no longer the janitor on her way to the closet. She was just Maya, walking toward a door with nothing but an idea and a crumpled piece of paper. The polished floor felt cold beneath her thin-soled shoes, and every squeak sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. Her palms were sweating. She wiped them nervously on her trousers. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, staring out at the sprawling grid of city lights. He didn't hear her approach. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. He looked smaller in person, more vulnerable. The weight of his failure was a physical thing, bending his frame. Taking another deep breath that did nothing to calm her nerves, she knocked softly on the glass frame of the door. He turned, his face a mask of irritation and exhaustion. "Can I help you?" "We're closed," he said, his voice sharp and dismissive. His eyes flickered over her gray uniform, and his expression hardened, as if her very presence was an annoyance. Maya's throat felt dry and tight. She forced the words out, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Sterling, my name is Maya. I'm the night janitor. And I know how to fix the $50 million problem." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unchanging. Then a short, humorless laugh escaped his lips. He turned away slightly, already dismissing her. "That's not funny. Security is on its way up." "No, please," she said, taking a hesitant step into the office. "Just give me 1 minute." 1 minute. The desperation in her voice must have cut through his exhaustion because he stopped and turned back to her. His arms crossed over his chest. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have 60 seconds. Start talking." The ticking clock in her head was deafening. She couldn't waste a second on pleasantries or explanations of who she was. She had to hit him with the one thing he couldn't ignore. "It's not a hack," she said, the words rushing out. "And it's not a virus. It's a flaw in the Merger 7 legacy code." The effect was instantaneous. The CEO's eyes widened, just a fraction, but it was enough. Merger 7 was the internal project name for the integration of the Omni Logistics acquisition. It was a term known only to a handful of senior engineers and executives who had been with the company for over a decade. It was not something a janitor could ever know. He didn't speak, but his posture changed. He was listening now. Really listening, emboldened, Maya continued, her voice gaining strength and certainty. "When a high-volume transaction from the old Omni system is processed at the exact same millisecond as a new data entry in your main ledger, it creates a race condition. The old system wins. It has a flawed data type conversion that corrupts the master entry. That's where the money is vanishing. It's not a phantom. It's a ghost from a system you forgot to properly exercise." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled, stapled papers. It looked pathetic, a mess of library printouts and handwritten notes. She held it out to him. "I built a simulation. It's all in there. The module, the data conflict, the patch to fix it. You just need to isolate the Merger 7 feat module and update the data handling protocol." Robert Sterling stared at the crumpled papers in her hand, then back at her face. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a fierce, unwavering conviction. He saw the same look he saw in the eyes of his most brilliant engineers when they were on the verge of a breakthrough. He slowly reached out and took the report, his fingers brushing against hers. The paper was cheap and flimsy, but the words on it felt like they were made of solid gold. He didn't read it all. He scanned it, his eyes moving rapidly, his mind processing the technical diagrams and the concise, clear language. It was brilliant. It was elegant. And it was the most plausible explanation he had heard in 6 weeks. It wasn't a complex, shadowy conspiracy. It was a simple, devastating mistake. The kind of mistake that happens when companies grow too fast and forget to clean up their own messes. He looked up at her. His expression no longer dismissive or annoyed. It was filled with a mixture of shock, awe, and a dawning, desperate hope. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I told you," Maya said, a small, shaky smile touching her lips. "I'm the janitor." Robert Sterling didn't hesitate. He turned to his desk and grabbed his phone, his movements suddenly sharp and decisive. He didn't call security. He dialed his head of it, the man who had thrown Maya's report in the trash. "It's Robert," he said, his voice filled with an authority that had been missing for weeks. "Wake up the entire Merger 7 legacy team. I don't care what time it is. Get them to the server room now. And you, get down there too. We have a new priority. I'm sending you a file." You are not to question it. You are not to analyze it. You are going to read it, understand it, and implement the solution it proposes. Is that clear? There was a muffled, confused voice on the other end of the line. I don't care if it's a recipe for apple pie, Robert snapped. Just do it. We're out of time and this is our only chance. He hung up the phone and turned back to Maya. For a moment, they just stood there in the quiet office, the city lights twinkling behind them. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company and the night janitor. Thank you, he said. The words filled with a sincerity that brought tears to Maya's eyes. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if her solution would work or if she would still have a job in the morning. But as she walked out of his office, leaving the man in charge to save his company, she felt a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The heavy secret was no longer hers to carry alone. She had done it. She had stepped out of the shadows and spoken truth to power. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like the sun was about to rise. The silence that followed her departure from the CEO's office was heavier than any she had ever known. Maya walked away from the corner office, her footsteps feeling unsteady and unreal on the polished floor. She had left her cart by the elevators, a forgotten piece of her old life. She didn't go back for it. Instead, she found herself drawn to a small, unused break room tucked away at the far end of the floor, a place with a single window overlooking the darkened city. It was a hiding spot, a place she had used before to steal a few moments of quiet. Tonight, it would be her watchtower. She didn't sit. She couldn't. The adrenaline that had propelled her through her brave confrontation was now ebbing away, leaving a trembling, hollowed-out feeling in its wake. She leaned against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, and listened. The 40th floor, usually a mausoleum of silence at this hour, was now alive with a low, frantic hum. She could hear the ding of the elevator, followed by the hurried footsteps of more people arriving. The IT team, the legacy engineers, the people who were supposed to have solved this weeks ago. Minutes stretched into an hour. She could hear muffled voices from the direction of the server room, a tense symphony of technical jargon and raised voices. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the tone, skepticism, frustration. She imagined the head of IT, the man who had so casually dismissed her work, now being forced to read it, to follow its instructions. A small, bitter part of her hoped he was feeling a knot of humiliation in his stomach. She pressed her ear against the cool glass of the window, trying to catch any snippet of conversation. At one point, she heard a voice she recognized as the IT head's, sharp and incredulous. There's no way. It's right here. The module is exactly where she said it would be, buried under 3 layers of deprecated code. A pause. Okay. Run the simulation she provided. I want to see it fail. Maya's heart sank. What if she was wrong? What if her simulation was flawed, a fluke that only worked in the controlled environment of the library computer? The weight of what she had done came crashing down on her. She hadn't just risked her job. She had gambled with the company's final, desperate hours on a hunch. If she was wrong, the collapse would be swift and total, and it would be her fault. Another hour crawled by. The voices from the server room changed. The sharp, dismissive tones were replaced by something else, a quiet intensity. She heard a different voice, a younger-sounding engineer say, "It's replicating. The simulation is producing the exact same data corruption. The phantom transactions. It's the race condition." She was right. A wave of relief so powerful washed over Maya that her knees felt weak. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor, her back against the glass, pulling her knees to her chest. She wasn't wrong. The theory was sound. Now, it was just a matter of execution. The tension on the floor shifted again. It was no longer about discovery. It was about action. She could hear the rapid clacking of keyboards, the calm, steady commands of the IT head, now directing his team with a new sense of purpose. Isolate the module. Apply the patch. I want a full diagnostic run on the master ledger. Now, Maya sat in the darkness of the break room, a silent spectator to the battle she had initiated. She watched the sky outside the window slowly begin to lighten, the deep indigo of night softening into a pale grayish blue. The city was waking up, unaware that a crisis of monumental proportions was reaching its climax, 40 floors above its streets. And then, a sudden, profound silence fell over the floor. The frantic energy vanished. The hum of the computers seemed too quiet. For a long moment, there was nothing. Maya held her breath. Had they crashed the entire system for good? Then, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't a shout of alarm, but a collective, muffled cheer from the server room. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief and disbelief. A moment later, the door to the server room swung open, and the CEO, Robert Sterling, walked out. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright with an emotion Maya couldn't quite name. It was more than just happiness. It was awe. He looked down the hallway, his eyes searching. He spotted the faint light from the break room where she was hiding and walked towards it. He found her sitting on the floor, looking small and exhausted. He didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against the doorframe, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. "It worked," he said, his voice soft. "The system is stable. The phantom transactions are gone. The money. It's all accounted for. You saved us." Maya just nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, too overwhelmed to speak. The next day, atmosphere in the Innovatic Tower was electric. The news had broken that morning. The financial anomaly had been resolved. The company's stock was rebounding, and the threat of layoffs had vanished. But the bigger story, the one that was spreading like wildfire through every department, was the story of how it had been solved. The story of the night janitor. As Maya walked through the office that day, pushing her cart for the last time, everything was different. People didn't look through her anymore. They looked at her. There were whispers, but they weren't the whispers of a company in crisis. They were whispers of wonder, of respect. An engineer from the IT department, a young man with glasses and a perpetually surprised expression, actually stopped her in the hall. "I wanted to say thank you," he stammered, his face flushed. "What you did, it was the most brilliant piece of problem-solving I've ever seen." He looked at her cart, then back at her, as if trying to reconcile the two different versions of her in his mind. That afternoon, there was an all-hands meeting called in the main auditorium. The room was packed, buzzing with anticipation. Maya stood at the back, feeling out of place in her gray uniform amidst the sea of business casual. Robert Sterling walked onto the stage to a thunderous applause. He held up his hands for silence. "We are here today to celebrate," he began, his voice strong and clear. "But not just because we solved a problem. We are here to celebrate the person who solved it." He proceeded to tell the story, not focusing on the technical details, but on the human element. He talked about a crisis that stumped the best minds in the industry. He talked about a solution that came from an unexpected place. Then he looked directly at the back of the room at Maya. "Everyone, please join me in thanking the person who saved this company. Our night janitor, Maya." Spotlight found her, and for a second, she froze. The entire auditorium turned to look at her. Then, the applause started. It began as a ripple, then grew into a deafening wave. It was the sound of 1,000 people, whose jobs she had saved, showing their gratitude. Tears streamed down her face as she stood there, bathed in light, no longer invisible. After the meeting, he asked her to come to his office. The head of it was there too. He looked at Maya, his face a mask of shame and humility. "I am so sorry," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I threw your report away. If it weren't for the CEO, I would have cost this company everything." Maya just shook her head. "It doesn't matter now." Robert waited until the man had left, then turned to her. "What you did was extraordinary, Maya, and we want to do something extraordinary for you. A bonus isn't enough. A promotion isn't enough. You are only in this position because life forced you to put your dream on hold. We want to give that dream back." He slid a piece of paper across his desk. It was an offer letter, but not like any she had ever seen. Innovatech Dynamics would pay for the completion of her education at any computer science program in the world. They would provide a full living stipend. And upon graduation, a guaranteed position was waiting for her. Not as a junior programmer, but as a lead systems architect on the company's core development team. Maya looked at the paper, her hand trembling as she traced the words. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a life. It was the future she had thought was lost forever, handed back to her. Weeks later, Maya walked through the Innovatech hallways, but she was no longer pushing a cleaning cart. She carried a textbook, her mind already filled with algorithms and data structures. People still smiled at her, but now it was the smile of colleagues, of fellow travelers on the same path. The squeak of rubber wheels had been replaced by the quiet, confident sound of her own footsteps. The ghost in the machine had been found, and in the process, the invisible janitor had finally become visible, her genius no longer a secret, but the company's brightest light.